Hey everybody, this is Charles Hain. I'm coming to you with the DJI FD in my hand. Now, I'm late to the game for a full review, so I'm not going to do one. Other people have covered it in detail. What I'm here to talk about is lens tests. What I'm always looking for in a camera is a camera that specifically solves a problem I've had in the past. It's all built in here. You throw it up, the autofocus is amazing. The autofocus works with older manual lenses. It's fantastic. Big fan. Three little niggles. One, I want finer tuning on the color control. Like right now, it doesn't have like a lot of individual steps on white balance, like easy software fix. Two, I want more fine tuning on the active track. So what I did on this a fuck ton is we set up a slider on a SERP, linear motor on a slider, and we'd go back and forth on C camera for an interview. I can show you a shot of that. And like, if you're a big bouncy talker, the active track bounced a little too much. I would love like an interview mode or something that like knows like, oh, I'm just supposed to keep a general middle. I'm not like super active tracky. Seems like an easy software fix. The last thing they need to do, and maybe it's a software fix, is they need to come out with their own linear motor. I was fine with the SERP. It did its job. It worked really well. But it was a separate control. And the first thing that would happen when we bring in a new operator to be operating it is they'd look at it and they'd say, okay, well, what button do I hit to start the linear? The intuitive thing is, if I'm gonna have this going back and forth doing an interview all day, I want a linear motor underneath it that's made by the same company or at least controllable with the same remote. Because the remote was like incredibly robust. And so I'd really like DJI to make a linear motor that I could just control with one button, and it all worked in an integrated way. The SERP treated us super well. We just had to have a separate iPad, and an operator had to learn like, oh, I hit go on the iPad, and then control active track on this. Those are my niggles. Other than that, I'm flabbergasted with joy at this camera. But why am I doing a lens review? So if you're thinking about getting this camera, the big limitation, which I'm sure you've all noticed, is it's a very small area where a lens can fit. It's like 3¼ inches, 3½ inches across where you can fit a lens, and the weight limit seems to be about 1.1, 1.2 pounds, which rules out like all of cinema glass. So I was like, well shit, if I'm really thinking about getting one, and I'm really thinking about getting one, I want to test every lens that you can get for it to know what lenses I might want to shoot. So we tested through the big list. The big modern lists are the Sigma, art and contemporary lenses, and Zeiss Batis. But we also tested in terms of new lenses, some Sony lenses because they're also on the list. But I also wanted to see if vintage would work. So we got some vintage Canon FDs and some modern Leicas in the M mount. Because remember, this is like mount neutral. You can put a DL mount, you can put an M mount, you can put an E mount. And I have so many thoughts. First big thought, the modern Leicas aren't really gonna work unless you get dedicated rings. Because if you see, it's a really tiny space in there. So you can't really use one of those like adaptable zip rings because it's going to hit something. It's going to hit your LiDAR. It's going to hit the motor. There's not a lot of room in there for like a zip ring. You need a dedicated ring. So if you're thinking, I've got all the money in the world, I'm going to buy an $11,000 Leica lens for this, you need to make sure you also spend like $300 or $400 to get a dedicated ring made for it. Especially because those Leicas have a little thumb bump, which makes it impossible to use a zip ring. Like those Dell ring clip-on rings. You need a dedicated ring. Now, unfortunately, there is a dedicated ring that would work called the Broken Anchor Zero ring, which is great. That has no little outpourings, but it's 4¼ inches, which is too big for 3½. Maybe DJI will come out with something with the Broken Anchor, maybe a DJI Broken Anchor collab, because I really love the Broken Anchor design, to let you use other lenses. But if you've got something like a Canon FD that's already been converted for cinema use, like we tested from cinema glass, thank you, Avi, it's great. You pop it in an E-mount, you pop the motor on the bottom, you calibrate to the lens, and all of a sudden you have a fully autofocused, LiDAR-driven Canon FD. So, you're about to see some lens tests, and you'll keep hearing my voiceover as we go of a whole bunch of these lenses on the DJI Ronin 4D, where you get to see a variety of choices. I'm going to talk at you over the lens review, so we'll do that, and then we'll come back at the end.
You're rolling. We're rolling.
All right, so this Canon FD 1960s, beautiful, popular lens, no internal motors. Everything you're seeing it do right now is with the external motor and a 0.8 Delrin ring around the edge. So if we look at our wonderful operator, Nico, I'm autofocused on my face. Now he's gonna pop me out of focus. I'm out of focus, and then he's gonna let it go. Autofocus comes right back to my face. That's just slick. that's just nice. It's using LiDAR to build a map of the world, and you can do that thing where you're like, I'm gonna start moody and out of focus, and then it's just gonna pop into focus on the thing you want when you're in the right mode. And then we walk, and hopefully it's keeping things smooth and silky. I'm gonna turn around. It's gonna keep following me. It is literally just a super exciting thing. But why am I excited about the FDs? Well, the original list of DJI lenses had some cool lenses in it I was excited about. And we're gonna be looking at a whole bunch of those in this test. But honestly, knowing that there's some cool vintagey options, like the FDs are among the most popular lenses in the world. And knowing that we can fly them on the 4D, for me, is like super duper cool. All right, we're rolling. This is the 135mm Zeiss Batis. So this is the other end of the spectrum. The Canon FDs are 60s. They were originally designed as still lenses. These Zeiss Batis also designed as still lenses, but this is as modern as design gets. They're natively E-mount. There is nothing on the outside except an OLED screen. There's no switches to go in and out of automatic and manual. There is really nothing. They're clean, simple lenses, but it's beautiful Zeiss glass. People love it, and you get sort of amazing things. And how many times in your career have you had a director say, let's do a 135mm walk and talk down the street? And here we are, we're doing a 135mm walk and talk down a Brooklyn street at night. I'm passing a car wash, I'm passing the beer store. Could this be a romantic comedy? Could I be talking to someone? Ha 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 ha, you're so witty. And we get this beautiful Zeiss bokeh in the background. So that Zeiss looks great, but it's very clean and modern. I wanted to go back to the 24. This is our wide. We had an audio problem, which is why it's now voiceover and you can't actually hear me talking. But we're on a 24mm. We're back to the Canon FD. So this is vintage. This is 60s design, 60s construction. Obviously at a 24mm, we have a deeper depth of field. So the fact that autofocus got added in post is a little less impressive. But we can really see when we throw it out of focus how beautiful that bokeh looks in the background, how smooth the texture is. I mean, there's a clarity to the Zeiss Batis, and there's a texture to the Canon FD. But depending upon what type of project you're working on, like there's a real appeal to that texture on the FDs. And one of the things I was really worried about with the Ronin 4D is that we were going to be stuck in this world of 100% 24/7 modern lenses, which is fine. We're about to look at a bunch of modern lenses and I like them and they're great. But like, I also like the texture of a vintage glass. Obviously that has been a very popular thing to pair with a wide variety of modern digital cinema cameras. So being able to like throw on, in particular, this 24mm FD, and here we go. Now we're in our test. Here's our Sigma 65mm. This is the contemporary lens. Looking at it, I really like the skin tone reproduction. I really like the way it flares. We've got that flare right behind my head. When we rack all the way up here to close focus, you really see the bokeh. You see, you know, the number of blades up there in the edges in that bokeh. Got a really nice rack focus. I personally, you know, not that there's like a winner in this whole setup, but I really walked away very happy with the Sigmas, and like, you know, the Sigma contemporaries come in about a third the price of the Zeiss Batis, and I'm not 100% sure that there's an argument you can be made. You definitely cannot make an argument that the Batis are like 3 times as good. There might be some places, especially around the flare, where you might be psyched to think about the Batis, but I'm really feeling like contemporaries come out well. So this is the Sony 14mm. It's the widest of the full frame that really works. So if you want that super wide, you want that like, I'm seeing everything in the world, the Sony 14mm is gonna be your winner. I think there might be a wider thing out there, but that also fits the weight limit. I mean, you know, there's obviously the IRIX, but the IRIX is too physically big, the 11mm. But that 14mm is like super wide. You've got that field of view and it fits well. So this is the Tamron zoom, the 17-28. I wasn't in love with the zooms because, you know, they're not parfocal. Technically they work, but they're not parfocal, so you sort of have to recalibrate them at different focus distances. I mean, at different fields of view. So you zoom out, you zoom in, and the focus doesn't behave the exact same way. So I could certainly see certain use cases, but I don't think I would personally 100% invest immediately in zooms for this camera. I think it'll be really fun if somebody makes a dedicated zoom that is parfocal for this camera. Looking at you, Fuji. But short of that, I don't know that there's necessarily going to be a really good fit in that space. So this is the 17-28 at the other end of the zoom range. But again, remember, you zoom in, you go from the 17 to the 28, and then you have to switch your calibration settings because the focus position is going to be in a different place. So I don't think it makes the world's most sense to do that. I'm not against it. But I think you're going to be much better off just having a 17 that you love and a 24 or 28 you love. I think that's going to make you much happier. So you're at the Zeiss 18. I think this is super wide. I would lean towards the Zeiss 18 over the Sony 14. I think it looks a little nicer to my eye. I also really love the cleanliness of the Zeiss Batis flare if you're going to have flaring units in frame. But, you know, not a dramatically different. Now as we go out here to, we back all the way up. You know, that 18 still looks really good. You can't argue with the Zeiss Batis. What you're getting with the Zeiss Batis is just a high level of cleanliness. Here we go. We're still on the Batis. We're going up to the 25. We're going to see that rack focus. Really pay attention on that rack focus to the way the out of focus bokeh looks in the background. You really see how clean it is. And there's a little bit of extra brightness in the bokeh. There's a little bit of like, brightness is the wrong word, crispiness maybe to the bokeh. I think of personally the Zeiss, like watching through these tests, the Zeiss are hands down the clean kit. If you're like, okay, I want the cleanest possible image, and then I'm going to step on it in post, I think the Batis sort of win that competition. I personally lean a little bit towards, we're going to get to more of the Sigmas here in a second. All right, so we're now moving on here to the Zeiss 40mm, which really nice looking lens. It's a really nice space for this camera. I feel like the 40mm, obviously, you know, 135, when we get to that, it's gonna be harder for the 4D to keep it smooth. It does it, but it's like definitely more work. Whereas the 40mm is like, I'm still getting this nice separation, foreground, background. Look at those big, nice, beautiful bokeh balls and sort of the texture you've got going there and that really nice close focus you've got on the 40. And so it's in sort of a nice space with that 40 where you're still getting sort of a layered shot. And the 4D is doing some amazing work smoothing it out such that, you know, you might not normally hold a full frame 40mm handheld, but now you can certainly hold a 40mm on the DJI 4D. So I think, yeah, I mean, the more I watch this, it's funny, it's always, everything is always a choice, right? So as a personal owner, would I maybe lean towards the Sigma Contemporary? Yeah, maybe. If I was buying for an institution, like I work at a film school, I've worked at other film schools, would I maybe try and push more for the Batis just because it's maybe a little bit like more neutral? Maybe. I mean, it really depends upon the kind of jobs you're doing and what you're thinking about are going to be your follow-through. My bummer with the Zeiss is that there's no outside controls on the lens. So like you can't switch from manual to automatic focus exterior on the lens. Like it's all controlled interior with menus, which is fine when it works, but makes me nervous. I'm really used to external switches, and the Zeiss Batis are like, nothing, no switches for you. You get no soup. And I like a little, you know, I'm old school. I'm older. I like those external switches. The 85 looked all shaky like that because we'd messed up the settings on the slider, but you're really getting into like a really nice, like look how little that flares. Like that's a big, I think that's the 600 just shooting straight down the barrel of the lens. We're pushing into it, we're pushing out of it. You're getting a flare, you're getting some softness, but if you look over there to the right of the frame, we're still getting nice contrast all the way down there in the lower right. So it's not creating this like big veiling flare over the whole image. We're just sort of ending up in a nice space, and that autofocus is doing sort of a really nice job. And now we're at the Zeiss 135, like that's very little flare. It's not like covering the whole image. It's like just sort of a nice little touch. Man, that 135 looks good. So, you know, we're in a really nice space. There's like some really good options, I think, when you're considering what you're going to do on the 4D, working within these limits where you're going to be happy with what you're getting. And you're able to get like really consistent color reproduction from lens to lens. And it's the other nice thing. I mean, I will say this for the Canon FDs, they looked way more consistent to each other than I thought they were going to look for camera from lenses from the 60s, but compared to what we're getting here with like some really nice consistency. Of course, now that we're at the 135, one of my eyes is in focus and the other isn't. I mean, that's really common when you're working WFO on a 135. That's sort of a normal thing. And now we're into a new space, the Canon 24mm. So this is the FD. So it's 1.2 because we were shooting WFO as much as we could. these lenses, I mean, you're seeing more flare. You're absolutely seeing more flare across the whole image. Totally a thing. That's the only real thing. And it's a little cooler than I thought it was going to be. But like, really amazing lens performance for something from the 60s. Really something that I think is like very impressive. And then once you add that LiDAR and the motor from the 4D, you know, you've got working autofocus. It's dancing there a little bit between subjects, but obviously that's something, if you're not a solo operator, if you're working with someone else and you're doing some active track, you're not going to struggle quite so much with what's staying as the subject. Oh, interesting. So now we're on the 35 at a 2. It's coming in a little dark. I'm wondering if maybe... I think we might have set the exposure for the 1.2, and now that we're at a 2, it's like a stop under. But you can really see that sort of pinpoint flare. That 35, also very nice. Really beautiful close focus. I have to say, you know, it's a tough deciding factor. No matter what, if you're getting the 4D, get the external motor, because, oh my god. I really hope that something comes out soon where we can see an adaptable ring, like something like a broken anchor, but 3 1/4 inches, so it can just fit in there without sort of, you know, the little loop that comes off the edge of just a zip ring. I'm looking tired here for some reason. Redoing the flare test here on the 24, running it a second time, because we really wanted to see flare in and flare out. Yeah, I mean, you're getting more flare, of course. Not a surprise. But not murderous. Not unusable, just some personality. Although you see the lowering in the contrast even all the way down to the lower right there. Now this is a DJI 35. DJI has, you know, a few lenses out right now. They were originally sort of aerial lenses. You can see how the close focus isn't amazing, right? We always sort of took that crystal up to close focus. It's not a close focus lens. It was originally designed for aerial work. They're not close focus monsters, but I don't hate this as much. I guess so many reviews were like, I don't love that DJI lens, that I was expecting to hate it. And it's a perfectly cromulent lens. It's perfectly nice. There's some nice crispness. Do I wish that I could get a little bit closer at close focus to get a little better close-up out of my 35? Yeah, I think that would be nice, but color reproduction looks good. Flaring is very minimal and controlled. I mean, I certainly could see, you know, Leica 21, 1.4. Now, we couldn't get autofocus working on these Leica because they had that nubbin on their ring, which made it we had to pull focus by hand. So, you know, living the life. I could see a scenario, before I talk Leica for a second, because we have a lot of Leica footage and not much to say. I could see a scenario where, like, you work with an institution that wants to buy the same. Like, you work at the Air Force or something, and they're like, well, DJI likes the camera, let's get the DJI lenses, and you end up with the DJI lenses. I still think you could actually make it work. I still think you could actually shoot some cool stuff with them. The close focus is what's going to really murder you. These Leicas are really nice, obviously. Like, the flare is incredibly controlled. You've got really minimal flaring, really nice reproduction. The color looks nice, yada yada. But, you know, they're between $8,000 and $11,000 each. They make a great rental from someone like Lens Rentals, although you'd want to make sure they were kitted out with focus rings if you did it. And thank you, Lens Rentals, for loaning them to us for this shoot. I mean, they're beautiful. I'm not going to say they're not beautiful. I don't know that they're worth 10 times the Batis or 20 times the Sigma in terms of the image quality you're getting from them. Because, you know, they're nice. Oh, they are really nice, aren't they? They just look really good. What I'm really looking for when I'm really, like, getting picky about a lens is, like, skin tone. Like, how nice does the skin end up looking? Because the lens is part of that. The way different wavelengths, and, you know, skin is different than other wavelengths, get bent and get smoothed and micro contrast and macro contrast. And, like, yeah, these look great. If I did a lot of fashion work and I was investing in a 4D, I would really think about the Leica with adapter rings. I'd have to be doing a lot of fashion work to justify $10 grand a lens. I look great there. That looks great. I'm not going to say it doesn't. But it's, yeah. oh, this is just goofing. This lens only covers Super 35, but we left it in full frame just so I could see sort of the whole party on the 30mm 2.8 just for funsies. Obviously, as you're focusing closer, you're going to get more coverage out of the rear image circle. Like, you would never do this on an actual job unless you were trying to do some sort of like 60s riff, but I figured it would be fun to just leave it all the way wide and still sort of get a sense of that Sigma 30mm, which again only covers Super 35. The 40 has a Super 35 mode. You could totally just switch it to Super 35 mode. I'm not saying you can't do that, but we just did in here for funs. You know, shooting these lens tests, you gotta do something to keep yourself entertained. Yeah, I mean, the Sigma are a little flatter, but I can always give myself contrast back later. And honestly, I don't mind a slightly flat lens. They're a little flatter than the other glass. There's a little bit more personality than the Batis, and certainly a little bit more like texture, but you know, it's a 90mm T 2.8. 2.8 is where you're gonna wanna be on a 90. You're probably not gonna wanna shoot at a 1.4 on a 90. And just have no depth of field to work with. Yeah, noticeably more flare than the more expensive lenses. You can't argue with that. Is it murdering you? It's not murdering me necessarily. Yeah, I mean, it's more than the Batis and it's definitely more than the Leica. But like, so what? Like maybe that's just part of life, that there's occasionally more flare. Shit, all right, so what is my conclusion? Holy shit snacks. Like, I'm leaning Sigma. I actually, after doing the tests, I emailed Sigma and I was like, you guys need to roll out a native set of DL mount glass. The reason why I think they should do a DL mount set that's specific for DJI is the lenses looked great, but in E-mount, the memory wasn't always great in terms of remembering what lens it was. You had to keep telling it. But with the DL, it just knows what lens it has. So I hope Sigma rolls out a set of DL mount for this camera because it'd be sick as shit. Those Zeiss Batis, also good. Also kind of amazing, a little pricier than the Sigmas, also really nice. And then you've got vintage options. Any vintage option that meets the weight limit. The Canon FDs are gonna be your best bet because they were originally still, but they're still really nice. But there's a few vintage options out there that are gonna fit within that outer diameter circle. The thing that was initially reluctant for me was, oh, what lenses am I gonna shoot? And now I feel like, okay, there are some choices, there are some options. I actually didn't hate the D-mount as much as I didn't hate the DJI lenses as much as other people did. The big drawback with those, I mean, they're beautiful. If you look at the body of them, they're great. It's carbon fiber, they're really light, there's no lens rings. It's designed for this kind of work where all of your focus and iris is being controlled by the camera. The drawback is they're not really amazing on the close focus. They're not really like popping super close because, you know, they're originally designed to be in the air. You're not flying a drone in someone's face, I hope. Don't do that. So I'm reluctant on that front. I think the DJIs are a legit option, but I think the Sigma and the Batis are like, oh, I have a full set of choices of a modern lens that I put on there and I get the autofocus. And I think those are the two real competitors. I think lenses are going to be a fascinating space on this camera in the next year.